I'll give you an introduction, and then we'll get the show on the road. Or okay. And is there a way I can put us on? Okay, we don't have permission to live stream. Okay. Good evening, everyone. My name is Chip Gibbons. I use he, him, his pronouns. I'm really excited about tonight's Socialist Night School because it's being held in conjunction with the International Day of Action to End the War in Yemen. DSA at the international level, DSA at the national level's international committee, which I serve on, has endorsed the Day of Action, and the chapter has as well. After the presentation, we'll have questions and answers, as well as someone from the chapter talk about how you can participate in the Day of Action here in DC. Also, the Day of Action was profiled in the International Committee of DSA's, and this is the National International Committee, not the local ones, newsletter of quarterly analysis. After the last convention, we were mandated to publish 2 quarterly newsletters, one of analysis of world events and news, and one of what we're up to, since many people were not sure what the International Committee was doing. There's a really nice summation of what's happening with the Day of Action in the analysis newsletter, which I'll include in the chat. And I would encourage you, if you're in DSA and want to get and care about international issues, to check out things we're publishing. I also want to give a shout out to East Bay, in addition to Metro DC, DSA. This is being co-sponsored by East Bay. So I want to introduce tonight's speaker without further delay. We're very honored to be joined tonight by Qatar Abdullah. She is with the Yemeni Alliance Committee, which organizes protests and actions, coordinates congressional visits, creates social media campaigns to resist anti-Yemeni policies, including for the Saudi-led war in Yemen, through the Yemeni Action Committee's advocacy and organizing, equipping communities and allies with tools to challenge the harmful national security and foreign policies that impact Yemeni Americans and their families here and in their homeland. So take it away from here.
Thank you for having me, first of all. So just a background about the Yemeni Alliance Committee. We are an action advocacy group composed of volunteer Yemeni American organizers that formed in the Bay Area of California. We've also started chapters in Michigan and New York, which I'm the organizer of in the New York chapter. We are nonpartisan, instead insist on the sovereignty of Yemen, and we came together to push back against our government's role in the oppressive policies on our family's homeland. We organize letters, draft and sign on to advocacy letters, coordinate lobby visits with lawmakers and elected officials. We create toolkits and talking points and write for various outlets on the plight of Yemen for Americans. Because warmongering is systematic, our goals have been to push policies that are for the peace and stability of Yemen and away from the global militarism and imperialism and away from waging endless wars. At first glance, the conflict in Yemen seems to be nothing more than a struggle for power between 2 warring groups in one country, civil war, or we hear that it's a sectarian war. And I want to make clear that what is happening in Yemen is not inherently a sectarian war. Although tensions have grown, it did not start as a sectarian war whatsoever, despite what the media tries to paint it. Over 60% of Yemen's population is Sunni, and over 30% are Zaidi. Zaidis and Sunnis have intermarried, share the same mosques without conflict. There is no 10-year period in Yemen's history since the 1960s that Yemen has not witnessed violent conflict or coups. Yemenis have yet to find a means to build institutions of state and society that can address successfully the grievance of political and economic marginalization and the alienation of populations disadvantaged by governing institutions and ethnic and sectarian discrimination, and of course, meddling from foreign powers. So just kind of like a backup of who are the Houthis and where did they come from. The Houthis, they are named after the group's commander, Hussein Badruddin al-Houthi, formerly known as Ansarullah. It's a movement that began in the early 1990s to promote a Zaydi revival, a return of the Imamat period, and to oppose Saudi influence. It has now morphed into an armed political group. The Houthis are predominantly Zaydis. This party is also composed of other Yemenis who may not necessarily be Zaydi, and not all Zaydis are Houthis. So Zaydis are a religious sect, and the Houthis are a political warring party in Yemen, who are very much Yemeni and have been in Yemen for thousands of years. So like the media also tries to paint them as this foreign terrorists or militias. They're Yemeni. They have been there. They have grievances, and they also have done their own fair share of crimes inside of Yemen. So historically, 40% of Yemen's population come from Zaydi family lines. Since becoming a militarized group, the Houthis or Ansarullah have been credibly accused of war crimes. If we look at modern U.S. policies in the post-war on terror era, since 9/11, America has militarized every aspect of its foreign policy. Long-standing tensions between values and interests tilted abruptly in favor of an extreme counter-terror approach. For Yemen, the war on terror has meant routine drone strikes, which continue till this day, detaining and torture of Yemeni nationals, and the Nasir program, the old Muslim registry, rescinded in 2016 by Obama, and systematic Islamophobia for Yemeni Americans and Muslim Americans here at home, which include FBI harassments, racial profiling, etc. So just the background of what's happening in Yemen. In 2011, and when the Arab Spring took the MENA by storm and the democratic wave entered Yemen fairly, the Arab Spring, and it has reached Yemen right after Tunisia and Egypt. Yemenis, especially the youth and women, poured into the streets, as I have family who were part of it, and I actually got to live that period in Yemen and see everyone just be part of the revolution. In a country that is highly armed, second to the US per capita, the protests were very peaceful. This revolt was peaceful until about May 2011, when the Islah Party joined the streets. Civil unrest in Yemen continued for the next 3 years. In September of 2014, the Houthis staged a coup and marched down to the capital from Saada and took over Sana'a and put Hadi under house arrest. Hadi was the president. He was the vice president of the former dictator and was unanimously appointed and elected, the only person running, and who other candidates were not allowed. So he was unanimously elected for president. On the eve of March 26, 2015, over 5 years ago, Saudi Arabia, under the leadership of MBS, the newly crowned Prince of Saudi Arabia, who had only been in power for 2 months, launched airstrikes on Yemen, abruptly escalating a civil war into a regional inferno inside the Middle East, inside the regional landscape, and under the guise of restoring the legitimate government of Yemeni President Abdul Rabbu Mansour Hadi. Yemeni's tiny military base was destroyed early on by the Saudi-led airstrikes as aerial bombings, target from border stations, shelling from the sea, and so on. And since then, the Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and its coalition, which includes the Arab countries of Kuwait, Bahrain, Sudan, Egypt, Morocco, and Senegal. Qatar stepped out of the coalition in 2017 after their drift with the Saudis. And Jordan's role is not really defined, but they have been, I guess, they're solidarity with the coalition. The coalition is backed and is supported by the US, the UK, and other partners who have been providing the coalition with the US trained Saudi forces. We also maintain, repair, and upgrade the coalition's vehicles and aircrafts. We provide intelligence support and targeting assistance. There have also been Green Berets, U.S. Special Forces at Saudi-Yemeni border. The U.S. used to refuel Saudi warplanes mid-air until 2018 after the Houthi was murdered by the Saudi regime, and there was a lot of media attention, and it was under a microscope, so the U.S. kind of stopped for a brief period from refueling the warplanes mid-air. In addition to military support, the United States, under the Obama administration, which continue, of course, under Trump, provided the coalition with weapons from U.S.-made bombs manufacturers such as Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, and Boeing. There have been over 120 arms contracts, totaling $120 million a month. It was never introduced. It was never a Trump-induced war, but airstrikes did spike significantly in 2018 under Trump. In the decade following September 11, just to make the connection between militarism and what's happening in Yemen. In the decades following September 11, 2001, War on Terror was born. Military spending increased 50%. In comparison, spending on every other non-military program, things like education, healthcare, public transit, and science, grew by only 13.5% over the same time period. In 2018, U.S. defense spending was $732 billion, more than 10 countries combined. This is annually 16% of the federal budget that we taxpayers pay for. In 2016, the biggest beneficiaries by country mile were Lockheed Martin, 36.2 billion. Boeing was making 24.3 billion. Raytheon was making 12.8 billion. General Dynamics was making 12.7 billion. Bomb makers that landed on Yemeni homes, hospitals, and weddings. So they're making their profits of destructions of others. The funeral hall and the wedding hall that had been bombed that killed hundreds in Yemen was by these bombing manufacturers and military contractors that the United States continues to sell till now. So this helps us understand part of the why. Why is the U.S. helping Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates against the poorest country in the Arab world who does not have an air force? War is a well-fueled machine which generates a lot of money. Wars are about business. If we don't provide supplies, another country would. This is a justification. It's American first kind of slogan that's used to justify the United States selling weapons. If we don't get it, if we don't sell it, somebody else will. Saudi Arabia has been after Yemen for decades. There's a history of invasions and land grabbing inside of Yemen. Currently, Saudi Arabia has a geopolitical interest in Yemen, wanting to control Bab el-Mandeb Strait, which is the fourth most important trading route in the world. It's between Bab el-Mandeb is between Somalia and Yemen. Bab el-Mandeb Strait is a strait of water that connects two larger bodies of water, where 4.8 million barrels of oil flow through it daily. It's the gateway to the Red Sea. Since the Gulf is the only wealthy due to its oil production, and oil is still essential, economic superpowers want to help the Gulf and their allies control these points, not just in Yemen, but also in the different parts of the world, like Iran. This is why what happens in Yemen is a focal point for the global economy. Shall we say blood for oil? Additionally, because Iran is an ally of the Ansar Allah movement, also known as Houthis, this makes Yemen more important for the stability of Saudi Arabia and the UAE. United States and other countries like Israel cannot afford to ignore Bab el-Mandeb to ensure their allies feel safe and U.S. interests are secure. The UAE has seized control of the land of Perium or Mayoun in 2015, which is next to Al-Hudaydah and near Bab el-Mandeb. The Emiratis have also controlled the island of Socotra, who attempted recently to legally take ownership of it. And they still control it till now. Essentially, and just to go back to the point of Socotra Island, there has been a lot of UAE and Emiratis visiting so the island and taking pictures there and kind of whitewashing their crimes. Essentially, the why is their interests and profits are the primary reasons why so many Western countries are supporting this brutal war. Another note about Al Hudaydah, its port city, and since Yemen relies on imported food and goods, over 70% of these things come through there. Or should the blockade has restricted the flow, which I'll go into. The blockade is a very, very important factor that contributes to the humanitarian crisis inside of Yemen, and it doesn't get as much media attention as it should. So I've been talking about the politics side of it. What does this impact look like on the ground? So a lot of people hear about the war, the clashes. Yet, I believe among the most brutal part of this war that receives very little attention is the blockade. The coalition imposed a naval, land, and air blockade. It's backed by the US Navy on Yemen since the conflict began in March 2015, which has severely restricted the flow of food, fuel, and medicine to civilians. It continues to prevent much aid and nearly all commercial imports from reaching Yemen. And when we say the Houthi-controlled parts, which has had a disproportionate impact on civilians' access to essential goods, which is backed and reinforced by the US Navy, which amount to economic warfare. Yemen depends heavily on imported food, medicine, and fuel. And for 80 to 90% of the population's needs. With a population of 30 million, that makes around 24 million Yemenis relying on imported aid. So recently, Trump and Pompeo have been threatening to immediately designate the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization prior to leaving office, making it a federal crime to knowingly provide material and support to any Houthi-controlled entity or person. Actually, they have done that this Monday, and this is making any humanitarian org that's donating or that's working in Yemen, they can actually be penalized for it. They know that Houthis control 80% of Yemen. This attack is using food as a weapon. It's economic warfare, which is a war crime. Aid has already been politicized since 2015, and the only airport available for Yemenis to travel out of Yemen is in Aden or Sayoun, which are both in the south. Sayoun is a long journey by car and bus, and hardly anyone has the means or health to travel there. So since 2015, a lot has happened, and also like the fact that both of the airports are in the south, and there's a lot of tensions between the north and the south, and that it's being intensified by both the UAE and Saudi Arabia, creating tensions between Yemenis themselves and the STC, which is the Southern Transit Council, which is backed by the UAE, and the Southern Transit Council is internally fighting with pro-government forces, which are backed by the Saudi coalition. And the UAE and the Saudi coalition are both working together. And so this kind of like divide and conquer is really working in Yemen for the interests of the Saudis and the UAE. So since 2015, just a little bit of kind of what's happening on the ground and how this has impacted the humanitarian aspect of it. Over 200,000 Yemenis have been killed by the violence. Saudi airstrikes caused 2/3 of civilian casualties in Yemen, and over 85,000 Yemeni children have starved to death due to the famine, according to the Save the Children. Recently, the UN released a report that predicts that the death toll will surpass 250,000 by the end of 2020. Yemen is already facing a famine. Over 18 million Yemenis are food insecure. 90% of Yemenis do not have access to electricity. Over 16 million Yemenis do not have access to healthcare. Over 3 million are internally displaced. Because of the war, blockade, the ban, Yemenis are effectively boxed in, and not to mention most Yemenis would rather die in Yemen than flee. And for those who do flee, hardly any country is willing to take Yemeni refugees. 10 million people are a step away from famine, and 7 million people are malnourished. As with all crises, women and children are the most vulnerable. 4.5 million children and pregnant women are accurately malnourished. This will drastically impact infant mortality and development. Over 16 million do not have access to clean drinking water. This has brought on fatal diseases such as cholera and diphtheria. The worst cholera outbreak ever recorded has infected 2.6 million, and thousands have died from this preventable disease, which should not even exist in the modern world. These are not just numbers. These are real people with real lives who at one point had dreams and goals like we all do. They all wanted a future like we all want. The amount of trauma that children born into Yemen during an ongoing war environment is yet to be recorded. That adds a layer of harm that we'll likely understand in the coming years. Now that COVID has entered the arena, COVID has spread faster, more widely, and with deadlier consequences than in many other countries. On the day that COVID was announced in Yemen, the World Food Programme and USAID cut aid into Yemen. This status over 2,000 declared COVID cases and over 500 persons has died. Genocide Watch considers Yemen to be at stage 9 at extermination. About the famine, we teamed up with a filmmaker and his team, Oscar and Emmy-nominated documentary Sky Fitzgerald, who risked his life telling stories in conflict zones with the power of cinema. They produced a short film in Yemen called The Hunger Word, which highlights the famine in Yemen and children. That screening was on January 16, and you can follow Yemen Alliance Committee for more details information about the movie. So, what has advocacy looked like, or what have we been doing, and what can Americans do to join the anti-war movement? Since the U.S. has been complicit, ideally, Yemenis should rebuild their future and be granted the autonomy to do so without foreign intervention or global militarism. As Americans, aside from protesting and raising awareness, which are very important, we have also been pushing legislation. While Congress never authorized U.S. intervention into the Yemeni war in 2015, we have to move through legislative channels to check that overreach. One pathway is by passing the War Powers Resolution, which is a congressional resolution designed to limit the U.S. president's ability to initiate or escalate military actions abroad. We've seen time and time again U.S. presidents abusing their power and overreaching. So the War Powers Resolution has been invoked about 3 times since 2017 by progressive lawmakers such as Rokahana, Murphy, Sanders, Lee. Last year, we had a huge victory when the War Powers Resolution passed through both chambers. It was bipartisan, yet as promised, Trump vetoed it. If you pursue through our Facebook page or other social media outlets, you'll find us asking folks to call their lawmakers and urge them to vote on one of these bills. The War Powers Resolution also included language that would cut arms sales to the coalition. Since we have a legacy of endless wars and war profiting, it's easy to understand why these measures failed, unfortunately. Expecting the Biden administration to approve a fresh one in his first 100 days in office. It's another step in checking legislative overreach of the new administration. If folks have relationships with their lawmakers, reach out to them right now and encourage them to co-sponsor HCON Rest 123. In 2020, we urged reps to support for an amendment to the NDAA that will pause all transfers of U.S. air-to-ground munitions to the Saudi UAE-led coalition fighting in the war in Yemen. The House and Senate rejected amendments to the NDAA, which would have reduced the 2021 Pentagon budget by 10%. A 10% cut would have made $74 billion available for responding to the coronavirus pandemic and other needs of people who aren't generals. The 2021 military budget gives the Pentagon $2.5 billion more than last year's NDAA, weighting it at a whopping $740.5 billion. So, in closing, we can see that the situation is complex and there are many factions in Yemen. There are also many challenges that I left out for the sake of time, such as the Muslim ban that still is in effect, Yemeni U.S. citizens not being repatriated, a decline in remittance, STC and other factions, Al-Qaeda, or how UAE has occupied Soqaitra Island and runs secret prisons, allegedly torturing and sexually assaulting Yemenis, or the fuel tankers which have been floating off the coast of Yemen loaded with more than 1 million barrels of crude oil. It's at risk of rupture or exploding, causing massive environmental damage to Red Sea marine life and international shipping routes. Each issue is a crisis of its own and feel beyond our control as Americans. So how can we reconcile with seeing all of the horrifying images and stories of starving Yemeni children, bombed school buses, hospitals, weddings, and the destruction of an ancient nation, knowing that our government has a role in the world's worst humanitarian crisis? What we can do as Americans is fight to end U.S. support for the coalition aerial bombing campaign on Yemen and cut arms sales to the coalition. We can protest, lobby, use our social media platforms to raise awareness, and if you're already an organizer, please consider incorporating steps to ending U.S. support of this illegal war on Yemen into your existing advocacy efforts. We have talking points, toolkits, and have ongoing campaigns to keep folks engaged and involved. Our ask of the new Biden administration is to restore and expand aid into Yemen and arms sales and military support for the coalition and all U.S. support for the war. And if the Houthis are classified as FTOs, we are urging that the new administration to reverse this inhumane designation that will drastically impact the Yemeni population, who relies on aid. We're organizing an International Day of Action for Yemen on January 25th, just days after the U.S. presidential inauguration and the day before Saudi Arabia's Devils in the Desert Future Investment Initiative. In the U.S., we're holding Biden's feet to the fire, urging him to correct the mistake he made in 2015 under Obama. Across the globe, countries are organizing solidarity rallies. Welcome folks to join us. We welcome them and encourage people to join their local rallies, either on the streets, if it's safe to do so, or online. Folks can go to our Facebook or Instagram page for updates. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that presentation. We're going to go. Can someone who still has hosting authority start my video or make me a co-host? David? Stephanie? No? Okay. If people have questions, can you please put them in the question and answer box, and I will read them to our speaker. Also, after the questions, Elliot is going to tell us how we can get involved in the Yemen Day of Action here in DC, as Metro DC DSA will be taking action on that day. Or if we don't have any questions immediately, Elliot, why don't you do that now? Oh, I can. I can be in a video, or I guess Elliot has stepped away from his computer.
Hi, Chip. I'm just trying to turn my video on. It says the host has
You want me to turn
stopped
your
it.
video on?
Please.
I am, oh, maybe I can't do that.
It's done. Elliot, you can do it now.
All right, Elliot.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Elliot. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a member of the Metro DC DSA chapter, the Internationalism Working Group, and also a member of the DSA Anti-War Subcommittee at the national level. First of all, thank you to Qatar for your informative and compelling presentation. Thank you to Chip and David for the night school program, especially Chip for suggesting this in the first place. Thank you to Dylan, Lindsay, and Aditi up at the DSA Anti-War Subcommittee for supporting actions for chapters all around the country. And thank you to Cesar Garzon and Don Chen, who were instrumental in putting this event together and have been organizing locally with Metro DC DSA for the day of action on the 25th. For the day of action, Metro DC DSA is partnering with other anti-war coalition organizations in a car caravan due to COVID safety outside the Saudi Arabian embassy. The reasons for this is twofold. One is the obvious because the Saudis are the lead perpetrators of this war with US support. And second specifically is because the 25th is the day before Saudi Arabia begins its Davos in the Desert conference on the 26th, which is meant to essentially make it a friendly place for the sort of international business elite to come and whitewash any of the war crimes that they've been perpetrating with Yemen or elsewhere. So I will put the link into the chat. Please sign up if you want to get involved. If you're a member of Metro DC DSA as well, please reach out to us either via the internationalism channel in Slack or internationalism@mdcdsa.org. We would love to have as many people come out as possible. Of course, given COVID, we understand all that, and also this, we don't know what the situation exactly will be in the Capitol on the 25th, but we are hopeful that the action will go forward and look forward to seeing people there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elliot, and thank you to the Internationalism Working Group for all that you do. And you also gave a shout out to Aditi and Dylan, and people who do not know who they are. I believe Dylan is attending tonight. They are the co-chairs for the national level anti-war working group. Like I mentioned before, I'm on the national level international committee steering committee. The anti-war subcommittee is one of the subcommittees I am liaison for. They work really hard. They do excellent work and really excellent organizing. And they're really phenomenal leaders in our organization on a national level on this issue. And we are a much stronger organization because we have them in their work.
Absolutely. They've helped organize, I'd say, upwards of a dozen different chapters around the country to make sure that they are either holding their own actions in person, participating with other organizations who are holding actions, or holding online events, social media events on that day. So they've been great in helping us all get mobilized.
And is there also an online rally that day, or did I imagine that?
So my understanding is that there is an online, both sort of a social media storm, and there will be looking to get specific hashtags trending. Lots of organizations, the Yemeni Alliance Committee will be leading that on Twitter. Follow them for information regarding that. And certainly DSA accounts will be supporting and boosting that as well. I also believe there is an online information seminar. I don't have that link in front of me.
I believe I thought I heard Jeremy Corbyn was going to be speaking.
Okay. Yes, I have heard that as well.
And I hear Jeremy Corbyn is quite popular in DSA. So I guess if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A box. I'll start off by asking a question, and I apologize if this is a heavier one. I believe it was last week. Last week, the US designated the Houthis a foreign terrorist organization. What are the ramifications of that designation for ending the war in Yemen? And why is that such a disastrous move for the State Department? How should Biden respond when he comes to power?
I think the ramifications of this designation is only going to hurt Yemenis. It will hurt them drastically. That should be a priority for Biden as soon as he can come to office, because 24 million Yemenis out of the 30 million rely on foreign aid. And so you have humanitarian orgs that work in Yemen will be criminalized for doing the work that they do and providing aid to the Yemenis. They are being starved, they are being pushed to famine, they are being bombed, and there's a blockade on them. And this is the last straw that any foreign aid that comes to them, it's being cut short. And so for the millions of Yemenis, this will have a dire impact on them. They're on the brink of famine, and so it will deter their organizations from doing anything. It criminalizes them. It also not only criminalizes orgs from working on the ground to help Yemenis, it also is a blocking stone for peace inside of Yemen, because once the Houthis are designated as a terrorist organization, you're excluding them from a peace process. If there is ever to end the war in Yemen, you're gonna have to bring the Houthis to the table. But this designation is not gonna allow the Houthis to be at the table, and the war will not end if the Houthis are not part of the conversation. They control 80% of Yemen? How do you expect them to give that up for nothing? It's just not rational to not include them in the peace process in order for the war to end, as well as the dire need for Yemenis for the aid. This is genocide. It's literally genocide if this designation is not reversed, because Yemenis are banned, blocked, they're bombed. There's so many problems, and they're being starved intentionally. And it's a last minute gift to the Saudis. So
we have a question from Garrett, and it's: do we know if Rokahana and Senator Sanders are working to get another war power resolution passed again soon?
Yeah, they are. They're working with other senators. It's going to be introduced soon, hopefully. And this time, there's not going to be a reason for it to be vetoed. So,
and the mechanics of the executive branch are such that, like, Biden could end the war without a war powers resolution, correct?
Yes, he can do that. It's more of like there's been a new report that Netanyahu and Israel are lobbying the Biden administration to be soft on their criticism of the Saudis. They're allies in the Middle East. So we're going to see how that translates into his policy. Biden has made pledges to end the war and stop selling weapons to the Saudis. So we are hoping that he takes those actions in the first 100 days of office. Hopefully, if the Israelis or Netanyahu is not successful in the lobbying softer on Khashoggi, then on the Saudis, we don't know what's going to happen until, I guess, we're going to see what the policy is, and if Biden will just continue to allow, or was it just lip service?
So we have a question from Elliot, and it's: what would you say to members of the Biden administration who previously supported the war under Obama, but then opposed it under Trump, such as Samantha Powers, Sullivan, others? How could they work to repair that harm?
It's when I see someone like Samantha Power opposing the war right currently, it's very hypocritical, to say the least. She was very instrumental in advocating for the intervention inside of Yemen, and so I think it's becoming now popular to do so. It's becoming popular to oppose Trump at any cost. Like, of course, he should be. It's wrong, regardless of who or what. But it will take more than just like them saying, "Oh, it's wrong," or concrete steps. Not just ending the war, the blockade, holding Saudis accountable. We want accountability. We want to hold the Saudis accountable for their war crimes inside of Yemen. We want reparations inside of Yemen. And so there's a long route, but remorse alone is not going to do. It's not going to help the Yemenis who have been bombed, who have been killed, who had their livelihood and everything stolen from them because of their actions.
So while the Obama administration was, a necessary component of getting the Saudi-led war in Yemen going, and they backed it, Biden, on the other hand, has stated that he's interested in ending U.S. support. Why do you think there's that shift amongst these people? Do you think it's just pure anti-Trumpism, or do you think it's because of the popular movements we've seen against the war, or some combination of both?
I think it's both, and I also think that it's bad press for them as well. The war in Yemen, it's not benefiting the U.S. personally. It's actually it's tainting the U.S.'s image even worse. I mean, if it's already not tainted, but it's even furthering. You're starving a population. It's the world's a generation. You're killing a generation of kids, a generation of people. The Arab world's poorest country, for what they have literally nothing to gain from this, and so they have seen no interest in keeping the Saudis happy. They haven't seen no interest in, I guess. They have seen it's counterproductive to support the Saudis, especially after Khashoggi's murder. So,
and what was the impact of that on the sort of attempts to end the war in Yemen?
I'm sorry?
Murder of Khashoggi. That was sort of a high-profile crime that the Saudis carry out. It wasn't directly related to the war in Yemen, but what kind of an impact did that have in the U.S. on support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen?
Yeah, I think the murder of the brutal murder of Khashoggi by the Saudi regime, it kind of really highlighted the war in Yemen, and the Saudi regime was kind of under a microscope, a bit more scrutinized, a bit more for their role inside of Yemen. And it was just talking to my cousins inside of Yemen, they were like, wow, what happened to Khashoggi was horrible, but they've been doing that for 4 years to us. Why is our life not as important? Why did it take a high profile person for them to actually look and recognize our humanity and our existence? But that's what it took. It took a high profile person that everyone knew and kind of related to for them to care. So it was horrible what happened to him. Yeah. But it did kind of shed a light on what's happening in Yemen.
You mentioned that the U.S. isn't really benefiting from backing this war. In fact, it's tainting our image more than it's already tainted. What do you think then is the driving force behind U.S. support for the Saudi war? I mean, I imagine if you interviewed a random American on the street who did not think a lot about foreign policy, I don't think they'd feel particularly gung-ho about helping the Saudi-led war in Yemen.
Yeah. I think it was just more of keeping the Saudis happy at the beginning under the Obama administration, and then with Trump, they were really close, especially with Jared Kushner, and so it was more of whatever the Saudis want, that's what we'll whatever to make them happy is what we'll do. But now after reevaluating their relationship with the Saudis, especially with their increasing human rights violations, this shift in the U.S. and push, I think on the organizing on the ground in the U.S. and around foreign policy and kind of turning to the left, it's also pushing politicians to reevaluate also their relationships with government actors in the Middle East. And so it's a combination of on the ground organizing the U.S. and also there's no need to keep the Saudis happy anymore.
Sure. So if anyone has any questions, please put them in the question and answer box. If not, we'll end a little bit early tonight. We have one question at the moment on the floor, but we don't have any other questions. So please, if you want to know anything about the day of action or the war, please type it in the Q&A box. And then Elliot has the question, and this is one I had as well. Can you elaborate on how larger U.S. demilitarization and anti-imperialism is key to preventing these sorts of crimes from continuing? E.g., Yemen has suffered from drone strikes and JSOC raids launched on the U.S. base in Djibouti. So there's an international component to these systems.
I'm sorry, can you please repeat the question?
Yeah, can you elaborate on how larger U.S. demilitarization and anti-imperialism is key to preventing these sorts of crimes from continuing? And I believe what Elliot alluded to is the fact that there's other U.S. Intervention in Yemen that's not just the Saudi-led war, and that the war powers resolutions don't actually impact that, such as the drone strikes that we saw even before the Saudi-led war.
Yeah, I think the demilitarization of the U.S. Their support and the fact the U.S. support and the international the military aspect of it is the driving force for Yemen. I feel like the military industry is very, very powerful. The U.S. lobbying, they lobby politicians heavily, and war is profitable, and their bombs that are being sold, that are used in Yemen, are being made by U.S. manufacturers. And so, like, let's say the blockade in Yemen, it's backed by the U.S. Navy. We have the U.S. soldiers at the border of Yemen. We have, like, the U.S. has many bases in the Middle East, and they're using those bases to kind of advance the Saudis' interest inside of Yemen. And so, like, this, if we kind of demilitarize the military, then they wouldn't have as much power to continue on with their hawkish, I guess, agendas in the world, and in Yemen in particular.
I think that's a really good point, and I want to bring up that when Rand Paul, who's usually not on our side, but on this issue largely is, went on CNN to oppose giving $1.1 billion US dollars in arms to Saudi Arabia, or selling $1.1 billion in arms to Saudi Arabia because of the war crimes in Yemen. This is what Wolf Blitzer, a journalist, asked him. I'm going to read this to you because it's pretty astonishing. So for you, this is a moral issue because you know there's a lot at stake. Certainly, if a lot of these defense contractors stop selling warplanes, other sophisticated equipment to Saudi Arabia, there's going to be a significant loss of jobs, of revenue here in the United States.
Updates ready to install.
That's secondary from your standpoint, which is just a remarkable thing for Wolf Blitzer, an objective journalist, to say, pushing back on a member of Congress who does not want to sell weapons used in war crimes. All right, we have two questions now. We have from Anonymous. I might have missed this before, but what do you project a peace process to look like, and how would power the country be divided?
And how, what? What's the second part of the question?
How would power / the country be divided?
Okay, that's a loaded question.
Yeah. I'm just reading this.
No, of course. How I would envision or would like to see the war in Yemen end, I would like to have all parties, like all the internal factions, grievances heard. I want every group, every in Yemen, we're very diverse in terms of, like, ethnic, tribal, wherever, I guess, religious sects and whatnot. And so I want representation from every group. I want, like, STC representation from the South. They also have the STC, although I strongly oppose it, they're there for a reason, and their grievances are valued and should be heard. The North, I really do feel like there should be a fair process, neutral third parties.
Did we lose Qatar? Did we lose the speaker, or are things just broken up on my end?
May have lost.
Okay. Why don't we give her a minute to see if she returns? Oh, you broke up for a minute. We lost you.
Oh, I'm like,
No worries.
well, okay, where was it? I don't know what you guys heard last because I was just
Yeah,
like talking.
power sharing.
Yeah, power sharing, fair process. I do not feel or want other foreign powers involved inside of Yemen, unlike the Riyadh agreement that was brokered by the Saudis and the UAE, or like this new installed government in the south that's all Saudi appointed inside of Yemen, with the exclusion of like the Houthis, or like the suppression of like members of the Islah and other parties inside of Yemen. And so it's literally Saudi appointed officials inside of Yemen. That's not something that I would want or champion. I would want a process where every grievances is held with accountability, and it's I don't think there's potential. There's so much potential for dialogue if there isn't foreign intervention, if there isn't foreign interest kind of controlling on the grounds and funding different factions, because at the end of the day we're all Yemenis brothers and sisters, and we get along, and so peace is possible.
Sure. So we have one more question. This might be the final one of the evening. The government often cites concerns over Iranian influence when rationalizing policy towards Yemen. What are your thoughts on that?
Okay. I really believe that Iran's role is highly exaggerated inside of Yemen. Yes, the Houthis are ideologically influenced by the Iranians, but that's just it. We're under blockade by air, naval, land. People say they bring weapons, and how when aid cannot international aid or foreign aid from the UN can barely enter the country, how will they be able to smuggle weapons or whatever they claim to be smuggling? I also feel like the U.S. tries to paint it as a proxy war between Saudi and Iran, which, by the way, is very, very dangerous. And people like to believe that because Iran is now the new boogeyman in the Middle East. And so they try to kind of justify their involvement inside of Yemen by countering Iran, which, when you look at it, it's Yemenis that are being bombed by the Saudis. It's not Iranians are being bombed by the Saudis. That shouldn't be the case at all. I'm not advocating for that, but I'm just like saying when there's Iran or Iran's pulled up, I think that's just like what they used to try to justify Saudi's involvement inside of Yemen and try to kind of like downplay the Houthis as though they are non-Yemenis or they're foreign or whatnot, and they have legitimate grievances inside of Yemen. And they're not really controlled by the Iranians as they claim. And like speaking to some Houthis, they're really offended by that statement that they're not their own individuals. I can't hear you.
Yes. So I guess I would like to build off of that and ask you, because you've mentioned that Netanyahu is pressuring the incoming Biden administration to not criticize Saudi Arabia. Obviously, that is about the Israeli-Saudi alliance, which has existed, in fact, for a long time and is now more out in the air. And that's very much about sort of containing or anti-Iran policy. How does the war in Yemen sort of fit into these larger power sort of attempts by the U.S. and its allies, Saudi Arabia and Israel, to sort of support assert hegemony in the region?
Yeah, Yemen is very, very important to the Saudis to win over. That's why for over 5.5 years, they've lost billions of dollars trying to win over the Houthis to prevent them from power. But every day they get stronger and stronger. And it's because of Iranian control and Iranian influence. They're all trying to kind of like blacklist Iran from the Middle East. And so this fits in with like the kind of a normalization with Israel in terms of the Middle Eastern countries, and anyone who doesn't really normalize or agree to the normalization with Israel is kind of like is seen as a threat, and a war isn't being controlled. It can't be tamed or controlled by the UAE or Saudi Arabia. Then that's seen as a threat, because if they're not being controlled by them, there's potential to be controlled by the Iranians. And yeah, it's and they try to reduce it to like this sectarian, like as a Sunni Shia conflict, when it's really I feel like it's very it does it very injustice, because it simplifies all the complexities into a Sunni Shia division, when in fact that's far from the truth.
Yeah, and I would just mention again, I put earlier, I'll do it again, I put the quarterly analysis of DSA's International Committee in the chat. And in addition to having an article on the Yemen Day of Action, it also has an article about U.S. ratcheting up tensions with Iran, as well as the Israel-Morocco deal, in which Israel agreed, or the U.S. agreed to recognize Morocco's occupation of Western Sahara in exchange for Morocco recognizing Israel, which is, has its own military occupation, Palestine. So we have a question from Jason, and that's, there was reporting that Biden advisors may be hesitant to remove the Houthis from the terrorist designation. If so, what is the best way to counter that so that humanitarian aid can go into the Houthi port?
I haven't read that article, but if that's true, I think there's growing support, bipartisan support for against this designation, from who we've been talking to. But if there is still hesitation for this designation, I feel like it's counterproductive to labeling them as they're labeling them as a terrorist to try to get them to negotiate or whatnot. I think this will make them stronger inside of Yemen. You have a country who's being bombed, blockaded, and starved, and the Houthis are going to be like, oh, you see, they can use this as kind of like organizing technique to organize the population that's being cut off their only source of survival. And it's counter to what the U.S. thinks, that they're trying to weaken them. That's actually going to make them stronger inside of Yemen. And I feel like a lot of people in Yemen, their support go for the Houthis daily, not because they ideologically agree with the Houthis or their sect or whatnot. They go their support for the Houthis because they hate Saudi Arabia and what they've done to Yemen. You have someone whose house is bombed, it's like, yeah, I'll take up arms against the Saudis or whatnot. And so this really will mobilize and make the Houthis even stronger inside of Yemen, counter to what the U.S. Department thinks will make the Houthis weaker, and it will have a drastic impact on the population, and peace will not be in sight if that's the case.
So I'm put a last call for questions. If anyone has any questions, please put them in the Q&A box. I've also just put the DSA quarterly analysis in the Q&A box in case it was sort of up too far in the chat for you to find. I would ask Elliot to put, not in the Q&A box, I put it in the chat box. I would ask Elliot to put the link to the DC action again in the chat box. And if there are no further questions, I would ask our presenter if she has any final thoughts for us. I don't see any questions, so it's floor is yours. Thank
you so much for having me. DSA, you guys have like Shehan, sorry, Shehan has been telling me about the work that you guys have been doing in DC, in the Bay Area. I worked with Dylan here in New York City. He's awesome. Shout out to Dylan if he's here. And so thank you guys all for the work that you do. As someone who has lived in Yemen and during the war and had to like escape the country through a boat and whatnot, it's really, really, really inspiring to see other folks out there who care and support, who are directly not impacted by this war whatsoever, but care and support about them. And like when I tell my family back home, they're just like so inspired and surprised and just really grateful that we have caring, conscious people out there. And so, yeah, like try to go to the Global Day of Action, try to join, and donate if you can. Call your lawmakers and just try to raise awareness. Your efforts will not go in vain. Thank you so much for having me and for all of you guys for being here, for listening, for the space. Yeah.
Qatar, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it. And I know you had to fill in on short notice and you did a wonderful job. I would never have guessed that you were filling in for someone else. It was really a fantastic presentation. David's going to tell us about our next night school.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Thank you to our presenter. Thank you, everyone who came out. Our next session, I'm going to be putting the link in the chat there. And so it is this week. It's on Thursday, January 21st. Police unions, and racial capitalism with Femi Taiwo, Stuart Schrader, and our own Nell Geiser. That'll be a great event. Also, on February 22nd, we're going to be hosting an event with Sarah Jaffe on her new book, Work Won't Love You Back. I think we're going to be soon announcing a few things and that'll be between those, but please check those out. We're going to have the Jaffe event up for you soon and some other things to announce soon, but also join us on Thursday.
So in the chat box right now, link to the upcoming night school, link to how to get involved in the DC car caravan as part of the Say No to War on Yemen action, and then a link to the National DSA's International Committee's quarterly analysis newsletter, quarterly analysis of world news and events, and which has a whole little write-up on the Yemen Day of Action and some information to get involved with DSA if you're not in DSA or not in DC on the Day of Action Yemen. And if that's it, I'm going to end the session. Have a good night, everyone, and thank you so much for attending.
Have a good night, everyone. Bye.
Bye.